In the quiet town of Maple Hill, the locals mind their own business. Life moves slowly here, the kind of place where everyone knows your name, but not necessarily your story. Beneath the surface of this town's quaint, sleepy charm lay lives riddled with their own secrets, secrets that, if unearthed, would change everything. This story begins with two young women, each with their own lives, their own families, their own paths. That is, until fate intervened and brought them together. Jayla and Amira, two girls who, by the hand of destiny, became sisters. Their story is anything but ordinary. Jayla Lewis had lived in Maple Hill her entire life. She was your typical small-town girl, smart, ambitious, but always restless. There was something about the town's predictability that made her feel like a caged bird. Her mother, Nicole Lewis, worked at the local high school as a history teacher, and Jayla was, for all intents and purposes, the model daughter. She got good grades, was polite, and never caused trouble. But there was a side of Jayla no one really knew, a quiet storm always brewing behind her calm exterior. Amira King, on the other hand, was new to Maple Hill. She moved there with her father, Malcolm, after her parents' bitter divorce. She was striking, beautiful, confident, with a fierceness that made her stand out among the other students. Maple Hill was far too small for someone like Amira, and everyone knew it. But when her father remarried, Amira found herself stuck in this small town with no way out. Amira and Jayla were not related by blood, but that would change soon enough. It was the summer before their senior year when Nicole Lewis and Malcolm King met. Both had been single for a while, Nicole raising Jayla on her own, and Malcolm, a successful businessman, raising Amira. What started as casual dates soon turned into something serious. Within 6 months, Nicole and Malcolm were married. That was the moment Jayla and Amira's lives intertwined. At first, the two girls were indifferent toward each other. They were both 18, mature enough to understand what was happening, but too old to fully embrace the idea of being sisters. Their worlds, though now connected, were miles apart. Amira was outgoing, a social butterfly, while Jayla was quieter, introspective. But something changed that fall. As they spent more time together, they grew closer. The awkward silences turned into late-night conversations. The side-by-side glances turned into shared laughter. Slowly but surely, a bond began to form between them. It wasn't long before people noticed how much they looked alike. Their skin tones, their facial features, even the way they carried themselves, it was uncanny. Though they shared no genetic ties, they could easily pass for sisters. Their parents marveled at how well they had adjusted to their new life as a blended family. From the outside, everything seemed perfect. But beneath the surface, something much deeper, and far more dangerous, was brewing. As the weeks turned into months, Jayla and Amira's relationship evolved. They weren't just stepsisters. They had become inseparable, spending every moment together, talking about everything from their dreams to their fears. It was in those quiet, private moments that something shifted. What had started as sisterly affection began to blur into something more complicated, more intense. One night, after a particularly long conversation in Jayla's room, they kissed. It was brief, just a moment, but in that moment, the world around them changed. They pulled away, shocked by what had happened, but neither could deny the electric charge between them. The next day, they didn't speak of it. They acted as though nothing had happened, going about their day as usual. But the air between them was thick with tension. Both girls were trying to figure out what this meant, what they were feeling, and more importantly, what they would do about it. Days passed and the kiss remained unspoken. But it was never far from their minds. Until it happened again. This time it wasn't brief. This time it wasn't an accident. It was intentional, deliberate. They kissed, and then they kept kissing. The floodgates had opened, and there was no going back. Their relationship had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. But how do you hide something like that? How do you conceal the truth when you live under the same roof, when your parents expect you to be nothing more than stepsisters? They decided they would keep it a secret. No one could know, not their friends, not their parents. They convinced themselves that it was the only way. They weren't doing anything wrong, they told themselves. They were in love. And love, they reasoned, was never wrong. For a while it worked. They maintained the facade of being nothing more than close siblings. They kept their stolen moments hidden from the world, sneaking kisses when no one was watching, exchanging glances that no one else understood. But secrets have a way of coming to light, especially in a small town like Maple Hill. It wasn't long before someone saw them. It was in the parking lot of their high school. They thought they were alone, but someone had been watching. Tyler Richardson, a junior at Maple Hill High, had noticed something strange about the two girls for weeks. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was something off. They were too close, too affectionate. It was subtle, but Tyler was observant. And then one day, he saw it, and he saw them kissing. Tyler wasn't just any kid. He had a reputation for being manipulative, for getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. And now, he had leverage. He cornered Jayla the next day after school. With a smirk, he told her what he had seen. "I know what you two are doing," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "And if you don't want everyone else to know, you're going to have to make it worth my while." Jayla's heart raced. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her worst fear had come true. Tyler knew. And if he told anyone, their lives would be over. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tyler grinned. "I haven't decided yet, but you'll know when I do." Jayla was terrified. She didn't know what to do. She told Amira that night, and they spent hours debating their next move. Should they tell their parents before Tyler did? Should they try to reason with him? But Amira had other ideas. "We can't let him ruin everything," she said, her voice cold and determined. "We have to find a way to shut him up." Jayla looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Amira didn't answer right away. She just stared out the window, her mind racing. Finally, she spoke. "We'll figure something out," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We always do." Jayla didn't realize it then, but in that moment, a plan had begun to form in Amira's mind. A plan that would change everything. A plan that would lead to bloodshed. At the time, Jayla thought Amira was just talking, just venting her frustration, but she would soon realize how wrong she was. Because Amira wasn't the type to back down. She wasn't the type to let anyone stand in her way, not even Tyler Richardson, and not even her own sister. But for now, all Jayla could do was wait and hope that Amira had a plan. Because if she didn't, their secret would be out, and their lives would be ruined. Little did Jayla know, this was just the beginning. The first domino had been tipped, and soon, everything would come crashing down. The secrets they were hiding were darker than anyone could imagine, and the lengths they would go to protect them, even darker still. The town of Maple Hill had no idea what was coming. There's a strange thing about secrets. They don't just exist quietly in the shadows, they grow, fester, and take on a life of their own. The more you try to contain them, the more uncontrollable they become. For Jayla and Amira, their secret was already spiraling out of control. The day after Tyler's threat, nothing seemed the same. Jayla woke up with a weight on her chest, the kind of pressure that made it hard to breathe. She went through the motions of getting ready for school, brushing her hair, throwing on clothes, eating breakfast. But everything felt wrong. Her mind was consumed by Tyler's words. She could still hear his voice, mocking, cold and dripping with power. Amira, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. She breezed through the morning like nothing had changed, but Jayla could sense the tension just beneath the surface, a cold steeliness in Amira's eyes that hadn't been there before. It was as if something inside her had shifted overnight. When they arrived at school, Jayla half expected to see Tyler waiting for them, smirking, ready to drop their secret at any moment. But he wasn't there. Not in the parking lot, not in the hallways. He was nowhere to be found. Jayla's relief was temporary. She knew Tyler was biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike. Don't worry about him, Amira said coolly as they walked to their lockers. He's all talk. Jayla glanced at her stepsister, uncertain. How can you be so sure? What if he tells someone? What if he... He won't. Amira interrupted, her voice firm. I'll take care of it. Jayla wanted to believe her, but something about Amira's tone sent a chill down her spine. There was a hardness to her voice, a resolve that made Jayla feel uneasy. The day dragged on in a blur of nerves and paranoia. Every time someone looked at Jayla in the hallways, she felt like they knew, like the secret was already out, spreading through the school like wildfire. But no one said anything. The world carried on as usual. Tyler stayed in the shadows, and Jayla could almost pretend that everything was fine. Almost. Later that day, as they sat together in the cafeteria, Amira was unusually quiet, her eyes scanning the room with a sharp intensity. Jayla watched her, trying to decipher what was going on in her head. There was something dark and calculating about Amira that Jayla hadn't noticed before. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Amira spoke. I've been thinking, she said, her voice low, almost a whisper, about Tyler. Jayla tensed. What about him? Amira looked at her, her eyes narrowing slightly. We can't just sit around waiting for him to make the first move. We need to act. Jayla frowned, confused. Act? How? We need leverage, Amira said, leaning in closer. Something to keep him quiet. Something he can't use against us. Jayla's heart raced. What kind of leverage? Amira didn't answer right away. She just stared at Jayla, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her words were measured and deliberate. Everyone has secrets, Jayla. We just need to find his. The thought of digging into Tyler's life, of finding something to use against him, made Jayla uneasy. She wasn't like Amira. She didn't have the stomach for games, for manipulation. But the alternative, letting Tyler hold their secret over them, was even worse. What if we can't find anything? Jayla asked, her voice trembling slightly. We will, Amira said with quiet confidence. Trust me. Jayla wanted to trust her, but something about the way Amira said it made her stomach turn. There was an edge to her now, a darkness that Jayla hadn't seen before. It scared her. But she didn't have a choice. That night, after their parents had gone to bed, Jayla and Amira met in Jayla's room. Amira had stolen Tyler's class schedule earlier in the day, and she had a plan. His family isn't exactly clean, Amira explained, laying out a series of printed documents on Jayla's bed. His dad's been in trouble with the law a few times. Nothing major, just some small-time stuff, but Tyler's been getting into fights, skipping school. He's not as perfect as he pretends to be. Jayla stared at the papers, her head spinning. She couldn't believe Amira had gathered so much information in such a short time. It was almost frightening how quickly she'd moved, how calculating she'd been. Amira continued, her voice calm and controlled. We'll use this. If he tries to blackmail us, we'll remind him that his life isn't exactly spotless either. Jayla nodded, but deep down she wasn't convinced. Tyler didn't seem like the type to be easily intimidated. He was bold, arrogant, and dangerous. And the more they pushed him, the more likely he was to push back. The next day they were ready. Amira had the documents hidden in her bag just in case. They spent the day waiting for Tyler to make his move, but once again, he was nowhere to be found. Jayla's nerves were on edge, the constant anticipation making her jump at every little thing. But Amira remained calm, almost disturbingly so. It was as if she was in complete control of the situation, while Jayla felt like she was barely holding it together. After school, they finally saw him. Tyler was standing by his car talking to some friends. He hadn't seen them yet. Jayla felt her heart pounding in her chest as she watched him, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. What were they going to do? How were they going to approach him? Amira didn't hesitate. She walked straight toward him, her posture confident, her face unreadable. Jayla followed, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. When they reached him, Tyler's smirk returned. He knew exactly why they were there. Ladies, he said, leaning casually against his car. "What can I do for you?" Amira didn't waste any time. She pulled out the documents and handed them to him without a word. Tyler's smirk faded as he flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with each passing second. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, his voice low and angry. Amira crossed her arms, her voice calm and cold. "You're not the only one with dirt, Tyler. You stay out of our business, and we'll stay out of yours." Tyler glared at her, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, Jayla thought he might actually lose it, might lash out at them right then and there. But then he smiled, a twisted, unsettling smile. "You think this is going to scare me?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You really think I care about this?" Amira didn't flinch. "Maybe you don't care, but I bet your dad does. I'm sure he wouldn't want this getting out. And I'm sure the school wouldn't either." Tyler's smile faltered just for a moment. Jayla could see the gears turning in his head, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Finally he spoke, his voice low and menacing. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Amira didn't respond. Tyler took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "You don't know who you're messing with." "Neither do you," Amira said, her voice ice cold. For a moment no one moved. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats. Then without another word, Tyler crumpled the documents in his hand, threw them to the ground, and walked away. Jayla let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She felt like she was going to be sick. But Amira was calm. "That went well," she said, her voice casual as if they'd just finished a normal conversation. Jayla looked at her in disbelief. "Well, Amira, he's furious. What if he—" "He won't do anything," Amira interrupted, cutting her off. "He knows we have leverage now. He won't risk it." Jayla wasn't so sure. Tyler didn't seem like the type to back down easily, and the way he'd looked at them, the hatred in his eyes, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, Jayla couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the confrontation in her head, wondering if they'd made a terrible mistake. Amira, on the other hand, slept soundly. The next few days passed uneventfully. Tyler kept his distance, but Jayla couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. She felt like she was walking on a tightrope, just waiting for it to snap. Then, one afternoon it happened. Jayla was in the library studying for an upcoming exam when her phone buzzed. It was a text from Amira. "Come to the gym, now." Jayla's heart skipped a beat. The urgency in the message was palpable. She grabbed her bag and hurried out of the library, her mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. When she reached the gym, she found Amira standing outside, her face pale, her expression unreadable. "What's going on?" Jayla asked, her voice shaking. Amira didn't answer right away. She just stared at Jayla, her eyes wide with something Jayla couldn't quite place. Finally, she spoke. "He's dead." Jayla froze. "What? Who's dead?" "Tyler," Amira said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found him, in the locker room." Jayla's mind went blank. She couldn't process what Amira was saying. Tyler was dead? How? What happened? I don't know what to do," Amira continued, her voice shaking now. "I just found him like that." Jayla felt the world spinning around her. She couldn't breathe. Tyler was dead. And somehow, Amira had been the one to find him. But something didn't add up. "Amira," Jayla said, her voice trembling. "What really happened?" Amira looked at her, her eyes filled with something dark, something Jayla couldn't understand. "I told you," she said quietly. "I found him like that." But Jayla wasn't so sure, because deep down she knew Amira was hiding something, and whatever it was far worse than she could have ever imagined. Maple Hill High School would never be the same. That much was certain. When a student is found dead on school grounds, everything changes. Parents pull their kids from classes, police swarm the hallways, and whispers echo through every corner of town. But when the victim is Tyler Richardson, popular, arrogant, always in control, the shockwaves are even stronger. No one saw it coming. No one except for Amira. Tyler's death cast a dark shadow over the town, but for Jayla it wasn't just grief or fear. It was the weight of something far more sinister. Amira had been the one to find him, lying there in the locker room, lifeless. But Jayla couldn't shake the feeling that Amira's story was more than just incomplete. It was a lie. And as the hours passed, her suspicion only grew stronger. In the hours following Tyler's death, the school was chaotic. Classes were canceled, and students were herded out of the building by teachers trying to remain calm, even as panic tightened their voices. Jayla could barely think straight. She walked alongside Amira, their footsteps in sync as they made their way to the parking lot, surrounded by murmurs from their classmates. "Do you think they'll find out what happened?" Jayla whispered, her voice trembling. Amira didn't look at her. Her gaze remained straight ahead, focused, determined. "They won't." Jayla's heart sank at the certainty in Amira's voice. How could she be so sure? The police presence increased as the day wore on. By the time Jayla and Amira arrived home, there were already news reports online, vague and incomplete, but terrifying nonetheless. Local student found dead under suspicious circumstances. Jayla sat on the edge of her bed that evening, staring blankly at her phone. The messages kept coming in from classmates, questions, theories, rumors, each one more outrageous than the last. She tried to focus on the screen, but her mind was elsewhere. The thought of Tyler lying in that locker room, the life drained from his body, kept flashing in her mind. And then there was Amira. Her stepsister, her lover, had found the body. Or had she? Jayla couldn't help herself. She had to ask. As soon as their parents were asleep, Jayla slipped into Amira's room. The light was still on, and Amira was sitting at her desk, scribbling something in her notebook. She didn't look surprised to see Jayla standing there. "We need to talk," Jayla said, her voice barely above a whisper. Amira set her pen down and turned to face her. "About what?" "About Tyler. About what really happened." Amira's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered. She didn't say anything, just stared at Jayla with that same cold, unreadable look. "Amira, please," Jayla pressed, her voice trembling. "I know you didn't just find him like that. You were planning something, weren't you?" There was a long pause. For a moment, Jayla thought Amira might deny it, might stick to her story. But then, with a deep sigh, Amira leaned back in her chair and spoke. "I did what had to be done," she said quietly, her voice steady, matter-of-fact. Jayla felt her stomach drop. "What? What do you mean?" Amira met her gaze, her eyes hard. "Tyler wasn't going to stop, Jayla. You know that. He would have kept coming after us, kept blackmailing us until he got what he wanted. We couldn't let him ruin everything." Jayla's mind raced. "So, you killed him?" "I didn't have a choice," Amira said, her voice chillingly calm. "He confronted me in the locker room. He threatened me. He said he was going to tell everyone about us. I had to stop him. I had to protect us." Jayla could barely breathe. Her head was spinning. "Amira, how could you do this?" Amira stood up, walking toward Jayla with slow, deliberate steps. "I did it for us, for you. Don't you see? I couldn't let him destroy everything we've built." Jayla took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Amira had murdered Tyler. She had killed him, cold-blooded, and she was standing here, calmly explaining it like it was the only logical solution. "You killed him," Jayla whispered, her voice shaking. "You murdered him." Amira's face hardened. "I saved us." Jayla felt like she was going to be sick. Her stomach churned, her mind swirling with the horrifying realization of what Amira had done. This wasn't just about protecting their secret anymore. It was about blood, about death. "What happens now?" Jayla asked, her voice barely audible. Amira's gaze softened slightly. Now we move on. We forget about it. The police will think it was an accident or maybe some other kid at school. We're in the clear, Jayla. We just have to keep our heads down. But Jayla couldn't forget. She couldn't just pretend that everything was fine. Tyler was dead, and Amira had killed him, no matter how much she wanted to believe that it had been necessary, that it had been for them. A part of her couldn't let go of the fact that Amira had crossed a line, one they couldn't come back from. As the days passed, the investigation into Tyler's death intensified. The police conducted interviews with students and faculty, combing through every possible lead. But as Amira had predicted, there was no clear suspect. No evidence pointed to them. To the outside world, Jayla and Amira were nothing more than grieving classmates, just two students caught up in the tragedy. But inside their home, the tension between them grew thicker by the day. Jayla couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Tyler's lifeless body on the locker room floor. She couldn't stop thinking about the moment Amira had decided to take his life. How could someone make a decision like that so easily? How could she sleep so soundly at night? But Amira was different. She didn't seem to feel the same weight of guilt that hung over Jayla like a cloud. She went about her days with a quiet confidence, knowing that they had gotten away with it. Jayla, however, couldn't move on so easily. Every time she saw the police officers lingering outside the school or overheard students whispering about Tyler's death, she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The walls were closing in and she was suffocating under the pressure. Then came the nightmares. Every night, Jayla dreamed of Tyler. She saw his face, pale and lifeless, staring up at her with wide, accusing eyes. In the dreams, he would reach out to her, his hand cold and blood-stained, pulling her down into the darkness. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. And it wasn't just the nightmares. She started seeing things during the day. Flashes of Tyler's face in the hallways at school, glimpses of his figure out of the corner of her eye. It was like he was haunting her, reminding her that his death wasn't something that could be swept under the rug. But the worst part was Amira. Amira, who didn't seem fazed by any of it. Amira, who looked at Jayla with that same calm, calculating expression every day. Jayla couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't really know her stepsister at all. The girl she had fallen in love with, the girl she had thought she could trust, was a stranger now. A stranger who was capable of murder. One evening as they sat in the living room watching TV, Jayla couldn't take it anymore. The weight of everything that had happened was crushing her and she needed answers. She turned to Amira, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. "How can you live with yourself?" Jayla asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How can you act like everything's normal after what you did?" Amira didn't look away from the TV. She kept her gaze fixed on the screen, her face expressionless. "I did what I had to do," Amira said quietly. "I don't regret it." Jayla stared at her, her heart pounding. "But he's dead. You killed him." Amira finally turned to face her, her eyes cold and unfeeling. "Tyler was a threat. I eliminated that threat. It's that simple." Jayla's stomach turned. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Amira wasn't just cold. She was dangerous. This wasn't about love or protection anymore. This was about power, control, and Jayla was terrified. For days, Jayla debated what to do. She couldn't keep living like this, suffocating under the weight of her guilt, while Amira remained unfazed. She thought about going to the police, telling them the truth about Tyler's death. But every time she considered it, the image of Amira's cold, calculating eyes flashed in her mind. What would Amira do if she found out Jayla was considering turning her in? Jayla wasn't sure she wanted to find out, but the pressure was building. Jayla couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. The guilt was eating away at her, and the nightmares were getting worse. She had to make a decision. Either she stayed silent and let Amira get away with murder, or she did the right thing and told the truth. One afternoon after school, Jayla found herself standing outside the police station. She had no plan, no idea what she was going to say, but she couldn't stay silent any longer. As she stood there, staring at the front door, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Amira. "Where are you?" Jayla's heart raced. She quickly typed a reply, her hands shaking. "Just out, I'll be home soon." Amira's response was immediate. "Don't do anything stupid." Jayla stared at the screen, her heart pounding. How did Amira know? Was she watching her? Had she been following her? The paranoia was suffocating. Jayla felt like she was being watched, like Amira had eyes everywhere. She quickly turned and walked away from the station, her heart racing. She couldn't do it. Not yet. But she couldn't stay silent forever. And deep down she knew Amira wouldn't let her. For Jayla, the days following her trip to the police station were a blur of paranoia and fear. Every glance from Amira felt like a threat. Every quiet moment between them loaded with unspoken tension. And yet, nothing had changed, at least on the surface. Amira kept moving through life as though the murder hadn't affected her at all. But Jayla knew better. She knew that behind Amira's calm exterior was something far more dangerous. A part of Amira that Jayla had never seen before. A part of her that was capable of cold-blooded murder. Jayla couldn't shake the feeling that Amira knew she'd been outside the police station that day. She hadn't told anyone, not even their parents. She didn't have to. Amira always seemed to know. Maybe it was the way Jayla's hands shook when she spoke, or the way her eyes darted around the room whenever the topic of Tyler came up. Maybe it was something deeper, something primal that connected them, binding them together in their dark secret. But Jayla couldn't live like this anymore. The nightmares, the guilt, it was consuming her. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't make peace with what had happened. She couldn't just pretend that Tyler's death didn't matter, that his blood wasn't on their hands. So she made a decision. She would confess, and it had to be done. She couldn't go on like this, trapped in a web of lies and murder. She needed to free herself from the crushing weight of the secret they were hiding. And if that meant turning herself in, if that meant turning Amira in too, so be it. But she had to be smart. She had to do it in a way that didn't arouse Amira's suspicion. If Amira even got a hint of what she was planning, Jayla feared what she might do. The truth was, she no longer felt safe around her. Every night she lay awake wondering if Amira was capable of more than just one murder. Maybe she'd kill again. Maybe she'd kill me. The thought chilled her to the bone, but it wasn't unreasonable. Not anymore. Amira had crossed a line. And if Jayla did anything to threaten the delicate balance between them, she wasn't sure what would happen. The next day at school, Jayla felt the walls closing in. The investigation into Tyler's death was still ongoing, but with each passing day, it seemed less likely that the police would find any new leads. The official theory was still unclear. An accident, maybe. But there were whispers of something darker. Foul play. But no one knew the truth. Not yet. Jayla sat through her classes in a haze, barely able to focus on the lessons being taught. Her mind was a storm of guilt and fear. Amira sat beside her in history class, as calm as ever, quietly taking notes. Jayla glanced at her, wondering how she could be so composed. How can you just sit there like nothing happened? The bell rang, jolting Jayla from her thoughts. As she packed up her things, she felt Amira's eyes on her. "You okay?" Amira asked, her voice low and even. Jayla forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." Amira didn't respond right away. She simply watched Jayla with those sharp, calculating eyes. After a moment, she nodded. "You've seemed distracted lately." Jayla's heart skipped a beat. Was Amira suspicious? Did she know what Jayla was planning? "I'm fine," Jayla said quickly, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's just everything going on. It's a lot." Amira studied her for a moment longer before offering a small, almost mechanical smile. "Yeah, it is." The conversation ended there, but Jayla couldn't shake the feeling that Amira knew more than she was letting on. She had to be careful. If Amira suspected that Jayla was planning to go to the police, things could get ugly, fast. That afternoon, Jayla skipped her last class and made her way to the local library. She couldn't go back to the police station. Amira would expect that. Instead, she needed to find another way to confess without drawing attention to herself. Sitting in the quiet corner of the library, Jayla pulled out her phone and began typing a message. She didn't want to leave a trail, but she had no other choice. She had to reach out to someone who could help. After what felt like an eternity, she finished typing. I need to talk to someone about what happened to Tyler Richardson. I can't keep this secret anymore. Her hands trembled as she read the message over again. Was this the right move? Would they believe her? What if Amira found out? But she couldn't let fear stop her. She hit send. A weight lifted off her chest, but it was short-lived. Jayla quickly deleted the message from her phone and left the library, her heart racing. The clock was ticking. Now that she'd reached out, there was no turning back. That night, as she lay in bed, Jayla's mind raced with possibilities. What would happen when the police received her message? Would they come for her? For Amira? Would her confession be enough to bring everything to light? And then there was the other possibility, the one that made her stomach churn. What if they don't believe me? The fear gnawed at her, but she knew there was no other choice. She couldn't keep this secret any longer. She had to free herself from the suffocating guilt. The next morning, everything seemed normal. Too normal. Jayla went through her routine like she always did, showering, getting dressed, grabbing a quick breakfast. But there was an undercurrent of tension in the air, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. It was the calm before the storm, and she knew it. As they walked to school together, Amira seemed more distant than usual. She didn't make small talk like she normally did. Instead, she walked in silence, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Jayla could feel the tension radiating off her, but she didn't dare say anything. They arrived at school, and the day dragged on like it always did. But Jayla's mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about the message she'd sent the day before. Would the police be waiting for her when she got home? Would they arrest her? Or worse, would they arrest Amira? The thought of Amira being taken away, handcuffed, made Jayla's stomach churn with a mixture of fear and relief. She knew it was the right thing to do, but it didn't make it any easier. By lunchtime, the anxiety had become unbearable. Jayla couldn't focus, couldn't think. She excused herself from the cafeteria, telling Amira she wasn't feeling well, and made her way to the bathroom. She locked herself in a stall, her heart racing. It's going to be okay. You did the right thing. But deep down, Jayla wasn't sure. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. That evening, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Jayla sat in her room, staring at her phone, waiting for something, anything, to happen. She couldn't focus on her homework, couldn't even think straight. All she could do was wait, but nothing came. No phone call from the police, no knock at the door. The silence was unbearable. Then, just as Jayla was about to give up hope, her phone buzzed. She grabbed it, her hands shaking. But it wasn't the police. It was Amira. Meet me in the woods behind the school. Now. Jayla's heart skipped a beat. Why would Amira want to meet her there? And why now? Fear gripped her. Did Amira know about the message? Was this some kind of trap? But she couldn't ignore the text. If she didn't show up, Amira would know something was wrong. She had to play along, at least for now. Jayla grabbed her jacket and slipped out of the house, her mind racing. The woods behind the school were secluded, quiet, a perfect place for a private conversation, or something far worse. As Jayla made her way to the meeting spot, her stomach twisted with dread. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew it wasn't going to be good. When she arrived, Amira was already there, standing beneath a large oak tree, her face hidden in the shadows. You came, Amira said, her voice calm, almost too calm. Jayla took a step forward, her heart pounding. What's going on? Amira didn't answer right away. She just stared at Jayla, her eyes cold and unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. I know what you've been planning, she said quietly. Jayla's blood ran cold. What? What are you talking about? Amira stepped closer, her gaze never leaving Jayla's. Don't play dumb. You've been thinking about turning me in, about confessing to what we did. Jayla's heart raced. How did Amira know? Had she seen the message? Had she been spying on her? I wasn't. Don't lie to me, Amira snapped, her voice suddenly sharp and dangerous. I know everything. Jayla froze, her mind spinning. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. Amira's eyes were locked on hers, cold and unfeeling. You think I don't know what's going on inside your head? Amira said, her voice low and menacing. I can see it. The guilt, the fear. You're too weak for this, Jayla. You've always been weak. Jayla took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. Amira, Yeah. Do you really think you can just go to the police and everything will be okay? Amira interrupted, her voice cold as ice. Do you think they'll believe you? Do you think they'll let you walk away? Jayla's stomach turned. She couldn't speak. She could barely breathe. Amira took another step forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. If you even think about turning on me, you'll regret it. Jayla felt the blood drain from her face. She wanted to run, to scream, to get as far away from Amira as possible. But she couldn't move. She was frozen in place, trapped by Amira's icy gaze. You're not going anywhere, Amira said, her voice calm again. You're mine, Jayla. You always have been. Tears welled up in Jayla's eyes as the weight of Amira's words crashed down on her. She was trapped. There was no escape. And deep down she knew one horrifying truth. Amira would never let her go. As Jayla walked back home that night, her heart felt like it had been ripped apart. She had come so close to confessing, so close to freeing herself from the weight of their secret. But now she was deeper in it than ever before. Amira knew, and she wasn't going to let her go. As the darkness closed in around her, Jayla couldn't help but wonder how far Amira was willing to go to keep their secret buried, and whether she'd survive to find out. Jayla woke up to a sense of dread that had seeped into her bones, heavier than ever before. Sleep hadn't come easily, and the few hours she managed were filled with nightmares that blurred the lines between what was real and imagined. She had dreamed of Amira standing over her, eyes cold, a smile that never reached her lips. The feeling didn't go away after waking. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep this up. Every day felt like an act, like she was walking on a tightrope with no net below. And at the other end, Amira was waiting, holding all the cards. For the past week, Amira hadn't let her out of her sight. She didn't say anything outright, but her presence was constant, oppressive. When they weren't at school, Amira would make sure to stay close, at home, during dinner, even when their parents were around. It was as though she was waiting for Jayla to make a mistake, daring her to crack under the pressure. Jayla thought about the meeting in the woods every day, the way Amira's voice had gone cold, the threat she had barely needed to say aloud. There was no question anymore. Amira wasn't the same person she had once been. That version of her, the one who had been Jayla's friend, confidant, and more, was gone, replaced by someone darker, someone who would do anything to keep their secret hidden. And now Jayla was stuck. That morning, as she got dressed for school, she glanced out her window. The woods behind their house stretched far and deep, casting long shadows across the ground. They looked almost inviting in the early light, but Jayla knew better. She would never set foot in those woods again, not after what had happened. Are you ready? Amira's voice came from behind her, startling Jayla out of her thoughts. She turned quickly to see her stepsister standing in the doorway of her room, watching her like a hawk. Jayla nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah, I'm ready. Amira didn't move right away. She just stood there, her gaze lingering on Jayla for a moment longer than was comfortable, as though she was searching for something. And maybe she was. After what felt like an eternity, Amira gave a small nod and turned, disappearing down the hall. Jayla let out a shaky breath, her heart pounding in her chest. It was getting harder and harder to pretend everything was fine. She didn't know how long she could keep fooling Amira, or herself. At school, the tension between them was even more palpable. They still sat together in classes, still exchanged whispers during lunch, but there was an invisible wall between them now, one made of fear and unspoken threats. Jayla could feel Amira watching her out of the corner of her eye, studying her, waiting for her to break. She had to be careful. The police investigation into Tyler's death had gone cold. With no new leads, the town was slowly starting to move on, though the rumors still swirled. Some kids said Tyler had been mixed up with the wrong crowd, that maybe it was drug-related. Others whispered that he had been part of a fight that had gone too far. No one suspected the truth. No one suspected them. But that didn't make Jayla feel any safer. If anything, the fact that they had gotten away with it made the situation even more unbearable. Every day felt like a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode. By the time the final bell rang, Jayla was ready to crawl out of her own skin. She had spent the day in a daze, barely able to focus, her mind consumed with the weight of what she knew. She needed space, air, anything to clear her head. But there was no escaping Amira. As they walked to the parking lot together, Amira spoke. "We should go out tonight." Jayla blinked, thrown by the sudden suggestion. "Out? Where?" Amira shrugged, her tone casual. "Just to a party or something. I heard some people from school are hanging out at the lake tonight." Jayla's stomach twisted. She knew better than to say no. Amira had a way of making even the simplest request feel like an order, especially now. "I don't know if that's a good idea," Jayla said, her voice hesitant. "We've been laying low." Amira stopped walking and turned to face her, a small, dangerous smile on her lips. "Exactly. We need to act normal. Go out. Have fun. We can't hide forever, Jayla." Jayla felt her throat tighten. Amira was right, in a way. But there was something about the way she said it, like she was testing Jayla, pushing her to see how far she could go before she cracked. "Okay," Jayla finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll go." The lake was a popular hangout spot for students at Maple Hill High. On any given weekend, kids would gather there to drink, party, and forget about the monotony of small-town life. Tonight was no different. By the time Jayla and Amira arrived, the sun was setting, casting the water in shades of orange and pink. A group of kids was already there, some sitting by the shore, others huddled around a bonfire that crackled in the cool evening air. Jayla had a bad feeling the moment they pulled up. The crowd, the noise. It all felt wrong. She hadn't been out in weeks, not since Tyler's death, and now the idea of being surrounded by so many people made her skin crawl. But Amira was different. She slid out of the car with an ease that made it seem like nothing had happened, like the past few weeks had been a bad dream. She flashed a smile at the group by the bonfire, waving at a few familiar faces, and Jayla had to remind herself that Amira was an expert at this, at pretending. Jayla followed her, feeling out of place, like a shadow trailing behind. As they approached the group, a few people greeted them, offering drinks and making small talk. Amira slid into the conversation effortlessly, laughing and joking as though everything was normal. But Jayla wasn't listening. She couldn't. Her mind was racing, her thoughts tangled in a web of guilt and fear. She glanced around, scanning the faces in the crowd. Everyone seemed relaxed, carefree, like nothing had changed. But for Jayla, everything had changed. After about an hour, Jayla couldn't take it anymore. She mumbled something about needing air and walked away from the group, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know where she was going, just that she needed to be alone. She made her way down to the water's edge, where the lake stretched out before her, calm and dark. The cool night air brushed against her skin, but it did nothing to ease the knot of tension in her stomach. She had to find a way out. She couldn't live like this anymore, constantly looking over her shoulder, constantly afraid of what Amira might do next. But what was the alternative? Turning herself in? Turning Amira in? The thought of facing the police, of confessing everything, sent a shiver down her spine. And what if they didn't believe her? What if... Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see Amira walking toward her, her silhouette outlined by the moonlight. Jayla's heart skipped a beat. "What are you doing out here?" Amira asked, her voice smooth, casual. "I just needed some air," Jayla replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Amira stopped a few feet away, her eyes scanning Jayla's face. "You've been acting strange lately." Jayla's stomach churned. "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." Amira didn't respond right away. She just stared at Jayla, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but sharp. "You're not thinking about doing something stupid, are you?" Jayla froze. Her blood ran cold. What do you mean?" Amira took a step closer, her eyes locked on Jayla's. "I mean, I've noticed the way you've been acting, like you're scared of something, or maybe you're scared of someone." Jayla's throat tightened. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. Amira's voice dropped to a whisper. "If you're thinking about going to the police or telling anyone about what happened to Tyler, don't."
Jayla's heart pounded in her chest. I wasn't...
But Amira wasn't listening. She took another step closer, her face inches from Jayla's. Her voice was barely audible now, but the threat was clear. "If you betray me, Jayla, I will make sure you regret it." Jayla felt her legs go weak. She wanted to run, to scream, to do something. But she couldn't. She was trapped by Amira's words, by their secret, by the fear that had been suffocating her for weeks. And she knew in that moment that Amira would never let her go. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Jayla went through the motions pretending to enjoy herself, but her mind was somewhere else, lost in the terror of what Amira had said. When they finally left the lake and drove home, Jayla couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Amira had made herself clear. There was no way out. Not for Jayla. Not unless she did something drastic. As they pulled into the driveway and walked inside, Jayla's mind raced. She had to figure out a way to escape before it was too late. But Amira was always watching, and Jayla knew one thing for certain. If she made one wrong move, Amira wouldn't hesitate to make good on her threat. That night, Jayla lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with possibilities. She couldn't live like this anymore, constantly afraid, constantly looking over her shoulder. But what could she do? If she went to the police, Amira would find out. And if Amira found out? Jayla shuddered at the thought. No. There had to be another way. And then slowly a plan began to form in her mind. It was dangerous, reckless, but it was the only option she had left. If I can't run from Amira, maybe I can stop her. Jayla didn't know if she had it in her to do what needed to be done. But one thing was clear. She couldn't wait for Amira to make the next move. Because if she did, she might not survive. Jayla's mind was a battlefield of fear and desperation. Every passing hour felt like a countdown to something inevitable. She couldn't run. She couldn't go to the police. And every day she spent trapped under Amira's control, the darker her thoughts became. There was only one way out. If she couldn't escape, if she couldn't confess without fear of retaliation, then she had to eliminate the threat. And that threat was Amira. It was a thought Jayla had never imagined she'd entertain, planning to stop the person she had once loved, the one who had been her closest ally. But the girl she had fallen for wasn't there anymore. Amira had transformed into something dangerous, and if Jayla didn't act, she knew she wouldn't survive this. She'd seen the cold look in Amira's eyes. Amira had already killed once, and Jayla couldn't shake the feeling that she wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Not if it meant keeping her secret safe. As the plan formed in her mind, Jayla felt a sickening mixture of terror and resolve. She didn't want to hurt anyone, but Amira had left her no choice. If she didn't act soon, she knew Amira would get rid of her, and the way Amira was watching her now, more intently, more possessively, confirmed it. There was no time left. The next few days were torturous. Jayla went through the motions of daily life with Amira, pretending everything was normal, even as her mind churned with her plan. The hardest part was keeping her anxiety in check, ensuring she didn't give away her intentions. Amira was sharp. She could smell weakness, could sense when something was off. The tension between them was unbearable. Every conversation, every shared glance was laced with unspoken threats. Jayla found herself jumping at the smallest things, Amira's hand on her shoulder, her voice too close, too calm. Jayla had to remind herself not to flinch, not to betray the fear that had taken root deep inside her. By the time Friday rolled around, Jayla had convinced herself that she had no other option. She had to move forward with the plan. The only way she could escape this nightmare was to take control of the situation. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. That evening, as they sat at the dinner table with their parents, Amira suggested they go out the next night. "Let's go to the cabin," she said, her voice casual but calculated. "We haven't been up there in a while." The cabin. It was a small secluded place in the woods that their parents owned, a family getaway spot. Jayla's heart skipped a beat. She knew what Amira was doing. The cabin was remote, miles from town, and no one would hear them if something went wrong. But it was also the perfect place for Jayla's plan. Their parents smiled, unaware of the tension that simmered beneath the surface. "That sounds like a great idea," Nicole said, glancing at Jayla. "You girls could use some time away." Malcolm nodded in agreement. "We'll stay here and enjoy a quiet night. You two have fun." Fun. Jayla felt bile rise in her throat at the word. Amira's eyes flickered with something dark as she looked at Jayla across the table. "What do you think?" she asked, her voice almost daring Jayla to refuse. Jayla forced a smile, her stomach churning. "Sure. Sounds like a good idea." The next day passed in a blur. Jayla couldn't focus, couldn't think clearly as she packed her bag for the trip to the cabin. She had spent the night replaying her plan over and over in her head, going through every possible scenario. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Amira wasn't stupid. She wouldn't let her guard down. But Jayla had to try. If she didn't, she would never get another chance. By the time the afternoon rolled around, Jayla was barely holding herself together. Amira, however, seemed as calm as ever, moving through the house with quiet efficiency as she gathered her things. It was unnerving how unaffected she seemed, as though she wasn't planning something terrible for the night ahead. As they loaded the car, Jayla couldn't stop her hands from shaking. She clenched her fists, trying to steady herself. She needed to stay calm, stay focused. One wrong move, one hint of hesitation, and Amira would know. "You seem tense," Amira said, her voice soft as she closed the trunk. Jayla swallowed hard, forcing herself to look at her stepsister. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just tired." Amira studied her for a moment, her eyes sharp. Then she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It'll be good for us to get away, just the two of us." Jayla nodded, her heart racing. She couldn't let Amira see the fear that was bubbling beneath the surface. As they drove out of town, the road winding deeper into the woods, Jayla could feel the tension tightening around her like a noose. The cabin was isolated. No one would hear them if something went wrong. And Jayla was certain that something would. The sun was beginning to set as they pulled up to the cabin, casting long shadows across the clearing. It looked peaceful, almost picturesque, but Jayla knew better. This place was about to become a battleground. As they got out of the car and unloaded their bags, Jayla's heart raced. Every step felt like she was walking toward her own execution. Inside the cabin, Amira moved through the space like she owned it. She turned on a few lights, opened a window to let in the cool evening air, and started a fire in the small stone fireplace. Jayla watched her, nerves frayed, wondering when it would happen, wondering when Amira would make her move. The silence between them was unbearable. "You've been quiet all day," Amira said suddenly, breaking the tension. She didn't look at Jayla as she spoke, her attention focused on the fire. "Something on your mind?" Jayla's throat was dry. She swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. "No, I'm just thinking." Amira finally turned to face her, her expression unreadable. "Thinking about what?" Jayla hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't tell Amira the truth. She couldn't reveal what she was planning. But she couldn't lie either, not without risking Amira's suspicion. "About everything that's happened," Jayla said carefully. "About Tyler." Amira's eyes darkened. She didn't say anything, just stared at Jayla for a long, uncomfortable moment. Finally she spoke, her voice low and steady. "We've already been through this. Tyler isn't a problem anymore." Jayla's stomach twisted. The coldness in Amira's voice sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't the girl she had fallen in love with. This wasn't the girl she had shared secrets with, laughed with, cried with. This was someone else entirely. "I know," Jayla said, her voice trembling. "But I just can't stop thinking about it, about everything that's happened." Amira stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You're not going to do something stupid, are you?" Jayla's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the threat hanging in the air, unspoken but clear. "I'm not," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. Amira watched her for another long moment before stepping back. "Good." Jayla let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The night wore on and the tension in the cabin grew thicker. Amira remained calm, her eyes never straying far from Jayla. It was as though she was waiting, anticipating something. Jayla's heart raced as she went through the motions of the evening, eating dinner, making small talk, pretending everything was fine. But beneath the surface, her mind was spinning with her plan. She knew she had to act soon. The longer she waited, the more dangerous Amira became. Later that night, when the fire had burned low and the cabin was cast in shadow, Jayla made her move. "I'm going to get some air," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Amira glanced up from her spot on the couch, her eyes sharp. "Don't go far." Jayla nodded, her heart pounding as she stepped outside into the cool night air. The woods stretched out around her, dark and silent. She could feel the weight of the night pressing down on her, suffocating her. But she couldn't turn back now. She made her way around the side of the cabin, her hands trembling. In her bag, she had hidden the one thing she had brought to protect herself, a kitchen knife, small but sharp. She wasn't sure if she'd have the strength to use it, but she couldn't face Amira unarmed. Not now. Jayla gripped the knife tightly, the cold metal biting into her palm. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts as she steeled herself for what was about to happen. She had to end this, but before she could take another step, she heard a voice behind her. "I knew it." Jayla froze, her blood running cold. She turned slowly to see Amira standing in the shadows, watching her, a twisted smile on her lips. "I knew you couldn't be trusted," Amira said, her voice low and menacing. "I knew you were planning something." Jayla's heart pounded in her chest. She tightened her grip on the knife, but her hands were shaking so badly she wasn't sure she could hold on. "Amira, you thought you could get away with it?" Amira interrupted, stepping closer. "You thought you could betray me?" Jayla took a step back, her mind racing. She couldn't let Amira get any closer. She had to act, now. "I didn't want it to be like this," Jayla said, her voice trembling. "But you left me no choice." Amira's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Only darkness. "Oh, Jayla, you've always been too weak." Before Jayla could react, Amira lunged at her. Amira moved fast, faster than Jayla had anticipated. One moment, they were standing across from each other in the shadowed clearing by the cabin, and the next, Amira was lunging at her, her eyes blazing with fury. Jayla barely had time to react. Her heart raced as she stumbled backward, trying to steady herself. The knife in her hand felt cold, foreign, like a tool she wasn't sure she could use. But Amira wasn't going to give her a choice. "You think you're going to hurt me?" Amira snarled, her voice low and dangerous as she advanced on Jayla. "You? You don't have it in you." Jayla's chest tightened. Her mind spun in every direction, replaying the weeks of fear, the constant pressure, the murder of Tyler, and now this. The girl she had loved was gone, replaced by something darker, something ruthless. Jayla gripped the knife harder, the weight of it pressing into her hand. "I don't want to do this," Jayla whispered, her voice trembling. Amira tilted her head, her smile cold. "Then don't." For a moment, Jayla's resolve wavered. She didn't want this. Didn't want to become like Amira. Someone who would take a life to protect a secret. But as Amira took another step forward, Jayla remembered why she was doing this. If she didn't act now, she would never escape. Amira would see to that. Amira lunged again, this time her hand outstretched, reaching for Jayla's wrist. Instinct took over. Jayla swung the knife wildly, a desperate attempt to keep Amira at bay. The blade slashed through the air, catching Amira's arm. Amira recoiled, hissing in pain as a thin line of blood appeared on her skin. "You're pathetic," Amira spat, clutching her arm but refusing to back down. "You're not going to win this." Jayla's hands shook, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She didn't want this. She never wanted this. But Amira wasn't giving her a choice. Jayla took a step back, trying to put more distance between them, but she knew she couldn't run. Not anymore. There was a madness in Amira's eyes now, something feral and terrifying. This wasn't just about control anymore. This was about survival. Amira saw Jayla as a threat now, and Jayla knew without a doubt, that Amira wouldn't hesitate to kill her if it came to that. "I loved you," Jayla said, her voice cracking as tears blurred her vision. "I loved you, Amira." Amira's smile twisted into something cruel. "Love? You think this is about love?" "This was never about love, Jayla. You're just weak, always have been. That's why you needed me." Jayla shook her head, her heart breaking. "That's not true. You changed, Amira. After Tyler had to die," Amira snapped, cutting her off. "He was a threat, and now so are you." The words hit Jayla like a punch to the gut. Amira had made her decision. She was willing to do anything to keep her secret buried, even if it meant killing the only person who knew the truth. Jayla's breath hitched as Amira rushed at her again, this time with more force, her hands outstretched like claws. Jayla raised the knife instinctively, and in that moment time seemed to slow. Amira's eyes locked onto the blade, but she didn't stop. She didn't even flinch. Jayla's world collapsed into a blur of motion and adrenaline. The next thing she knew, the knife connected. Hard. Amira gasped, a sharp, broken sound that cut through the air like a knife. Jayla blinked, stunned, as Amira stumbled back, clutching her side. For a moment, neither of them moved. The night around them seemed to hold its breath. Then Jayla saw it. The blood. It was dark, almost black in the dim light, spreading across Amira's shirt like ink. Jayla's heart stopped. "No," Jayla whispered, her voice breaking. "No, no, no." Amira looked down at the wound, her expression unreadable. Her hand pressed against the gash, blood seeping through her fingers. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to meet Jayla's eyes. You really did it," Amira said, her voice weak but filled with disbelief. "You actually—" Jayla's knees buckled. She dropped the knife, her hands shaking uncontrollably. I didn't mean to." Amira's eyes darkened with something Jayla couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even pain. It was something far more sinister. She stumbled forward, her hand reaching out as if to grab Jayla one last time, but her strength was fading fast. I warned you, Amira whispered, her voice low and venomous. I warned you not to cross me. Jayla felt tears streaming down her face, her vision blurring as she watched Amira stagger, her body swaying as if gravity was pulling her down. She wanted to help her, wanted to reach out, but her feet were frozen in place. Amira's legs finally gave out. She collapsed onto the ground, the impact muffled by the soft earth. The sound of her breathing was ragged, shallow. Jayla stood there, paralyzed, her mind refusing to accept what had just happened. Amira, her Amira, was dying. The silence that followed was unbearable. Jayla stood over Amira's body, her hands trembling, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would tear through her chest. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. All she could do was stare down at the girl who had once meant everything to her. Amira's breathing was uneven, shallow gasps that barely seemed to fill her lungs. Blood soaked the ground beneath her, staining the earth dark red. The night around them felt oppressive, as though the forest itself was closing in, bearing witness to the horror that had just unfolded. Jayla sank to her knees beside Amira, her hands hovering above her, unsure of what to do. Amira, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But Amira didn't respond. Her eyes were half closed, her face pale and drawn. The fight had drained out of her, leaving only a fragile, broken shell of the girl she had once been. Jayla reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against Amira's blood-stained hand. It was cold to the touch. Too cold. I didn't want this, Jayla whispered, tears streaming down her face. I never wanted this. Amira's lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile, more like a grimace. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out right away. When they did, they were barely more than a whisper. You really thought you could win? Jayla flinched, her chest tightening. Even now, with blood spilling from her body, Amira refused to give in. Amira's breath hitched, her hand twitching in Jayla's grip. Her eyes flickered open, but the fire that had once burned so brightly in them was gone. She was fading, fast. I loved you, Jayla whispered, her voice thick with grief. I loved you, and you ruined everything. Amira's lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but it was too weak to be sure. We ruined each other. The words hit Jayla like a slap to the face, knocking the breath from her lungs. She wanted to argue, wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that Amira had been the one to push them down this path. But deep down she knew that wasn't entirely fair. They had both played a part in this. In each lie, in each secret. They had both destroyed everything they had once held dear. Amira's eyes fluttered shut, her breathing growing shallower with each passing second. The tension in her body slowly drained away, leaving her limp and still. And then, with one final ragged breath, Amira was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Jayla sat there for what felt like hours, her knees digging into the cold, damp earth, her hands stained with Amira's blood. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket, pinning her to the ground. She had killed her. She had killed the one person who had meant more to her than anyone else in the world. Jayla's chest heaved as the realization hit her like a tidal wave. She felt sick, her stomach twisting in knots, bile rising in her throat. She had thought she could save herself, thought she could escape Amira's control. But all she had done was trade one nightmare for another, and now there was no going back. The knife lay discarded in the dirt beside her, its blade glinting in the faint moonlight. Jayla stared at it, numb, unable to process the full weight of what she had done. She had killed Amira, and no one would ever understand why. The drive home was a blur. Jayla couldn't remember how she had managed to stand, how she had forced herself to leave. The drive home was a blur. Jayla couldn't remember how she had managed to stand, how she had forced herself to leave Amira's body behind in the clearing. Her mind was fractured, the weight of her actions pressing down on her chest like a crushing vice. The cabin was still, fading into the distance as Jayla gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her hands were shaking, her body trembling uncontrollably, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not after what she had done. The dark, winding road ahead stretched endlessly into the night, but Jayla's thoughts were stuck in that clearing, replaying the moment Amira had collapsed, her blood soaking the earth. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Amira's face, pale, twisted with pain, eyes flickering with a mixture of hatred and something Jayla could no longer recognize. The girl she had loved was gone, and it was Jayla who had taken her life. Tears blurred her vision, but Jayla blinked them away, forcing herself to stay focused on the road. She couldn't afford to break down now. Not yet. She needed to get home. She needed to figure out what to do next. The consequences of her actions were waiting for her, looming over her like a shadow she couldn't escape. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the adrenaline that had been carrying her began to fade, leaving behind only a hollow emptiness. The house was dark, quiet. Her parents were likely already asleep, completely unaware of the nightmare their daughters had been living. Jayla wished she could just walk inside, crawl into bed, and pretend none of it had ever happened. But there was no pretending anymore. She parked the car and sat there for a moment, her mind racing. Her clothes were stained with dirt and blood, Amira's blood. The scent of it clung to her, suffocating her, a constant reminder of what she had done. Her hands were trembling as she glanced down at them, the red streak still vivid under the dim glow of the streetlights. She had to clean herself up. She had to make it look like nothing had happened. Jayla slipped out of the car and quietly closed the door, every movement calculated and deliberate, her mind running on autopilot. She crept into the house, making sure not to make any noise as she moved through the darkened hallways. Her parents' room was just down the hall, but their door was closed, and she heard nothing from inside. The bathroom felt too bright, too sterile as she turned on the light. Jayla stared at her reflection in the mirror, her breath catching in her throat at the sight of herself. She looked like a stranger. Her hair was a mess, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and haunted, but it was the blood on her hands that made her stomach turn. She had never imagined this, never imagined that she would end up here, in this moment, covered in the blood of the girl she had once loved. She turned on the faucet and began scrubbing her hands, watching as the water turned pink and swirled down the drain. But no matter how hard she scrubbed, the feeling of Amira's blood wouldn't go away. It was under her skin, in her soul, a stain she couldn't erase. Hours passed, though Jayla wasn't sure how many. The house was still silent when she finally slipped into bed, her mind numb with exhaustion. But sleep didn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Amira lying there, her body limp and lifeless, her blood staining the earth. Jayla curled up under her blankets, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know how to move forward. She didn't know what would happen next. All she knew was that she had crossed a line she could never uncross. And she was completely, utterly alone. The next morning came too quickly, the sun rising and casting soft light through her bedroom window. Jayla hadn't slept. Her body ached, her mind still spinning with the events of the night before. She had hoped in the quiet hours of the night that maybe it had all been a dream, that when she woke up, everything would be normal again. But there was no escaping the truth. She stayed in bed for as long as she could, trying to gather the strength to face the day. Her parents would be up soon, and they would expect her to act like everything was normal. She had to go through the motions, had to pretend that her world hadn't just shattered. Eventually, she forced herself to get up, moving mechanically as she went through her morning routine. Every action felt disconnected, like she was watching herself from a distance, her mind still caught in the events of the previous night. She couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, about Amira. What would happen when someone found her body? Would they suspect foul play? Would they trace it back to her? The questions churned in Jayla's mind, but she couldn't focus on the answers. Not yet. There was too much to process, too much to fear. When Jayla finally went downstairs, her parents were sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and reading the morning paper. The smell of breakfast filled the air, and for a moment, it was like nothing had changed, like she wasn't hiding a terrible secret just beneath the surface. "Good morning," her mom said with a warm smile as she looked up from her mug. "You're up early?" Jayla nodded, forcing herself to smile. "Yeah, I couldn't sleep much." Her dad glanced at her over his newspaper, frowning slightly. "Everything okay? You look tired." Jayla's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to notice, and now panic was bubbling up inside her. She had to lie. Had to make sure they didn't suspect anything. "I'm fine," she said quickly, her voice a little too high-pitched. "Just a lot on my mind, I guess." Her parents exchanged a glance, but neither of them pressed further. Jayla let out a quiet breath of relief as she grabbed a glass of water from the counter and sat down at the table. She could feel their eyes on her, but she avoided looking at them directly. If they looked too closely, they'd see the cracks, the fear. "Did you and Amira have fun at the cabin last night?" her mom asked casually, taking another sip of coffee. The question hit Jayla like a punch to the gut. She hadn't thought about this, about what she would tell them. Her mind raced, trying to come up with something, anything that would sound convincing. "Yeah," she said after a long pause, forcing another smile. "We just hung out, talked a lot." "That's good," her dad said, turning back to his paper. "You girls need to make time for each other." Jayla nodded absent-mindedly, but her mind was far from the conversation. The clock was ticking. Someone would find Amira's body soon, and when they did, everything would come crashing down. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. Jayla pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from a classmate, someone she barely talked to. "Hey, is Amira with you? I haven't seen her today." Jayla's heart stopped. The blood drained from her face, her stomach twisting in knots. She couldn't breathe. Her parents were watching her, their conversation suddenly quieting as they noticed the change in her expression. "Who's that?" her mom asked, her voice concerned. Jayla's mind was spinning, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had to lie, had to cover this up somehow. But every word felt like a boulder in her throat, too heavy to push out. "It's nothing," Jayla muttered, forcing herself to stand. "I'm not hungry. I think I'm going to go lie down." Her parents exchanged another concerned look, but they didn't stop her as she quickly left the kitchen and made her way back upstairs. Her heart was racing, her mind unraveling. The message on her phone felt like a ticking time bomb. Amira's absence wouldn't go unnoticed. People were already looking for her. And when they found her... Jayla collapsed onto her bed, her body shaking with silent sobs. She had killed Amira. She had killed her, and now the world would know. Hours later, Jayla lay in bed, her phone buzzing again and again as messages came in from friends and classmates. The panic was setting in, the storm was coming, and there was no escape. Jayla's heart raced with every notification, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her like a physical force. She had thought she could save herself, thought that by eliminating Amira, she could finally be free. But she had been wrong, and she wasn't free. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own making. And soon, everyone would know the truth. The news broke faster than Jayla had anticipated. By mid-morning, whispers of Amira's disappearance had spread through Maple Hill. Social media was buzzing with rumors, some speculating that she had run away, others wondering if something more sinister had happened. But no one knew the truth. No one except Jayla. She stayed in her room, unable to face the outside world. Her phone continued to buzz with messages from friends and classmates, all asking the same question: "Where's Amira?" Jayla ignored every one of them, her stomach churning with fear and guilt. She knew it was only a matter of time before the police got involved, before Amira's body was found. And then they would come for her. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind spiraling with thoughts of what would happen next. Would they figure it out right away? Would they trace everything back to her? And when they did, what would she say? What could she say? Jayla had never been a good liar. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the weight of the secret she carried pressing down like a vice. There was no way out now, not after what she had done. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Her phone buzzed again, and this time Jayla couldn't ignore it. With trembling hands, she picked it up and glanced at the screen. It was a message from Amira's father, Malcolm. "Jayla, have you seen Amira? She didn't come home last night, and we're worried. Please let me know if you hear from her." Jayla's heart sank. Malcolm had no idea what had happened, no idea that his daughter was lying dead in the woods. Guilt washed over her, heavy and suffocating. She couldn't bring herself to respond. She couldn't lie to him. Not now, not after everything. Tears welled in her eyes as she set the phone down, her body shaking. She had destroyed their family. She had taken everything away from them, and soon they would know it was her fault. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Jayla's stomach clenched as she wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. "Jayla?" It was her mom's voice, soft but filled with concern. "Can I come in?" Jayla took a deep breath, forcing herself to sit up. "Yeah," she called out, her voice shaky. The door creaked open, and her mom stepped inside, her brow furrowed with worry. She looked at Jayla for a moment, before sitting down on the edge of the bed. "I've been getting some calls," her mom said gently, her eyes searching Jayla's face. "About Amira." Jayla's heart pounded in her chest. She nodded, her throat tight. "Is everything okay?" her mom asked, her voice laced with concern. "I know you two went to the cabin last night, but did something happen? Is she with someone else?" Jayla's stomach turned. The weight of her mom's questions was suffocating. She couldn't lie. She couldn't say anything without breaking down. I don't know," Jayla stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't." Her mom's expression softened, and she reached out, placing a comforting hand on Jayla's arm. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm sure she's fine. Amira's a smart girl. She's probably just off with friends. But if you hear from her, you need to let me know, okay?" Jayla nodded numbly, tears stinging her eyes. Her mom gave her a small, reassuring smile before standing up and leaving the room. The moment the door clicked shut, Jayla's composure crumbled. She buried her face in her hands, her body racked with silent sobs. She had never felt so alone. By midday, the police were involved. Jayla watched from her bedroom window as a squad car pulled into the driveway, her heart pounding in her chest. 2 officers stepped out, their faces grim as they approached the front door. She knew what was coming. They were here to ask questions, to gather information about Amira's disappearance, and Jayla would have to lie. She heard her mom greet them at the door, her voice tinged with confusion and concern. A moment later, her dad's voice joined the conversation, low and serious. Jayla couldn't make out the words, but she knew they were asking about the last time anyone had seen Amira. Her hands shook as she sat on the edge of her bed, waiting. She knew they would come for her next. She was the last person to see Amira alive. They would want to know everything about that night. The drive to the cabin, what they talked about, whether Amira had seemed upset. Jayla's heart raced as the minutes dragged by. She felt like a caged animal, trapped and helpless. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear and guilt, and she had no idea how she would get through this. Then came the knock. "Jayla?" It was her dad's voice this time. "The police need to talk to you about Amira." Jayla swallowed hard, her throat dry. She stood on shaky legs, her mind spinning with excuses, with lies. But none of them felt solid. None of them felt real. When she opened the door, her parents were standing in the hallway, flanking the 2 officers. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a kind face, gave her a reassuring smile. "Hi, Jayla," he said softly. "We're just trying to piece together what happened. We understand you and Amira were at a cabin last night." Jayla nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. "We know this must be a difficult time for you," the officer continued, his tone gentle. But anything you can tell us about last night would help. We're just trying to find out where she might be. Jayla forced herself to nod again, her pulse pounding in her ears. We went to the cabin, just for the night. We talked, hung out. The other officer, a woman with sharp eyes, chimed in. Did Amira say anything that seemed strange? Did she mention wanting to go somewhere? Meet someone? Jayla shook her head, her voice trembling. No, she didn't. She didn't say anything like that. We just talked. The female officer narrowed her eyes slightly, but her voice remained calm. And when did you last see her, Jayla? Jayla's stomach twisted. This was it, the moment she would have to lie, the moment she would have to cover up the truth. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. We went to bed late, she said, her voice shaky. I fell asleep, and when I woke up, she was gone. The words tasted bitter on her tongue, but she forced them out. She couldn't tell them what had really happened. She couldn't. The officers exchanged a glance before the woman spoke again. So you didn't see her leave? You didn't hear anything? Jayla shook her head, her heart pounding. No, nothing. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jayla could feel her parents' eyes on her, could feel the weight of the officer's scrutiny. She wanted to scream, to confess everything, but she couldn't. She couldn't do it. The male officer cleared his throat, breaking the tension. Thank you, Jayla. We're going to keep looking, but if you remember anything at all, you let us know, okay? Jayla nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The officers gave her one last look before turning and heading back downstairs, her parents following closely behind. As soon as they were gone, Jayla collapsed onto her bed, her body trembling with fear and guilt. She had lied. She had lied to the police. And now, she was trapped in the web she had spun. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because they still hadn't found Amira's body. The hours dragged by in a haze of anxiety. Jayla couldn't focus on anything, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. She just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with the weight of what she had done. Every sound outside made her heart race. Every phone call made her stomach twist with fear. She knew it was only a matter of time before they found Amira. And when they did, the real questions would begin. Would they be able to trace it back to her? Would they know it wasn't an accident? Jayla's thoughts spiraled, each one darker than the last. She had no idea how she was going to survive this. She had thought killing Amira would free her, but it had only made things worse. There was a knock at her door again, this time soft and hesitant. Her mom's voice called through the wood. Sweetheart, are you okay? You haven't eaten all day. Jayla didn't respond at first. She couldn't. The thought of food made her feel sick. The thought of anything other than Amira lying dead in the woods was impossible. After a long pause, she forced herself to speak. I'm fine, Mom. Just tired. Her mom's voice was filled with concern. Okay. Just let me know if you need anything. Okay? Jayla waited until she heard her mom's footsteps retreating before letting out a shaky breath. She couldn't keep doing this. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when her world was falling apart. The door opened again, but this time it wasn't her mother. Jayla's blood ran cold as she saw a shadow slip inside her room, moving silently toward her bed. Jayla. She froze. It was Amira's voice. Jayla's heart stopped as she sat up, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes darted around the room, but there was no one there. She was alone, but she had heard it, clear as day. Jayla. The whisper came again, soft but unmistakable. Jayla's body trembled as the sound of Amira's voice echoed through the room. It was impossible. Amira was dead. She had seen her die. But the voice was there, lingering in the air, filling the room with its cold presence. And in that moment, Jayla realized something terrifying. She wasn't going to escape. Not from the police, and not from her guilt, and not from Amira. The next morning, Jayla's world came crashing down. The police had found Amira's body, and now they were coming for her. Jayla knew the end was coming. It had been inevitable since the moment she left Amira's body in the woods. The phone calls, the questions, the creeping realization that she couldn't lie her way out of this. It had all been building toward this moment. But nothing could prepare her for the crushing weight of it. The knock at the door was like a gunshot, reverberating through the quiet house. Jayla was sitting at the kitchen table, her fingers curled around a mug of cold coffee she hadn't touched. Her parents were still upstairs, blissfully unaware of the nightmare that was about to unfold. She heard her mom call out from the top of the stairs, "Jayla, can you get that?" Her heart pounded as she stood up, her legs shaking beneath her. The seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last, as she made her way to the front door. She didn't need to guess who it was. When she opened the door, 2 officers stood on the porch, their faces grim. One of them was the same officer who had come the day before, kind but serious. He gave her a small, tight nod. "Jayla Lewis?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. Jayla nodded, her throat tight, unable to find her voice. The officer's partner, a stern-looking woman with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, took a step forward. "We need to ask you a few more questions. Can we come in?" Jayla's stomach turned. She wanted to say no, to slam the door shut and pretend that none of this was happening, but there was no escaping it now. Her hands shook as she stepped back and let them in. The officers entered the house, their presence suffocating. Jayla could barely breathe as they made their way into the living room, their eyes scanning the house as though it held all the answers. Her parents appeared at the top of the stairs, confusion etched across their faces. "Officers?" Jayla's mom asked, descending the stairs slowly. "What's going on?" The male officer looked at her mom and gave her a somber nod. "We need to speak with your daughter in private. There's been a development." Jayla's dad's face paled. He stepped forward, his voice suddenly sharp. "What kind of development? What's this about?" The female officer didn't hesitate. "We've found Amira King's body." The room seemed to freeze. Jayla's mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and her dad took a step back, his face draining of color. Jayla stood there, rooted to the spot, her body trembling violently. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing the words spoken aloud felt like a punch to the gut. Her mother's voice broke the silence, filled with disbelief. "Her body? What do you mean? How?" The officers exchanged a look, the weight of the situation settling heavily between them. The male officer spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "We believe Amira's death was not accidental. There are signs of foul play." Jayla's dad's voice shook with anger and confusion. "You're saying she was murdered?" The officer didn't flinch. "We're treating this as a homicide investigation, and right now we need to speak with Jayla." All eyes turned to Jayla. Her mom's eyes were wide with shock, her voice cracking. "Jayla, why? What does she have to do with this?" The officers ignored her question, their focus entirely on Jayla. "We need to ask you some questions about the night Amira disappeared," the female officer said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Jayla felt her knees buckle. Her legs couldn't hold her up anymore. The room seemed to spin around her, voices blurring, sounds fading. She could hear her parents arguing with the officers, demanding answers, but none of it registered. All she could think about was the look on Amira's face as she fell to the ground, blood seeping from the wound. She had done this. She had killed her. And now she would have to face the consequences. "Jayla," the officer's voice broke through the haze. "We need to know what happened that night. When was the last time you saw Amira?" Jayla's breath hitched. This was it, the moment where her lies would catch up to her, the moment where everything she had been trying to hide would come crashing down. She looked at the officers, her mind spinning. She could lie again, tell them the same story she had given before, say that she had gone to bed and woken up to find Amira gone. But they would know. They had to know. Her parents were watching her, their faces twisted with confusion and fear. They didn't know what was going on, didn't know the dark secret their daughter had been keeping. And now, Jayla would have to tell them. Jayla started, her voice trembling. I don't know. I didn't see her leave. Her dad's voice cut through the tension. Jayla, what are they talking about? Why are they asking you these questions? And Jayla's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She couldn't look at her dad, couldn't face the horror that would soon paint his face when he learned the truth. Her body trembled and she felt as though the floor was about to swallow her whole. The officers exchanged another glance, sensing her hesitation. We're trying to piece together Amira's movements that night, the male officer said carefully. Her body was found not far from the cabin you mentioned. We need to know if there's anything you can tell us that might help. Jayla's mind screamed for her to confess, to tell them everything, about the fear, the fight, the blood. But the words wouldn't come. She couldn't get them out. Her throat felt tight, her lungs constricted, and the walls around her seemed to close in. The guilt, the terror, the crushing weight of what she had done. It was too much. Her mother's voice broke through again, desperate and pleading. Jayla, please, what happened? Just tell us. Tears welled in Jayla's eyes as she stood there, paralyzed by the enormity of the situation. She could feel her parents' eyes on her, could hear the police officers waiting for her to speak. But she couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. I'm sorry, Jayla whispered, barely audible. The room fell into a heavy silence. What do you mean, sorry? Her dad asked, his voice tight with fear. Jayla felt the walls closing in, the weight of everything she had done crushing her chest. She could feel the words rising in her throat, but they were jagged, too painful to say aloud. I didn't mean for it to happen, Jayla finally choked out, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for any of it. Her parents' faces twisted with confusion and horror, but the officers stayed calm, watching her closely. What do you mean, Jayla? The female officer asked softly, taking a step closer. What happened that night? Jayla's legs gave out and she collapsed onto the floor, her body shaking with sobs. She couldn't keep the truth inside anymore. It was eating her alive. We fought, she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. Amira and I, we fought. I didn't mean for it to go that far, but she wouldn't stop. I had to stop her. Her parents froze, their faces pale with shock. Her mom's hands trembled, covering her mouth as her eyes filled with tears. Her dad stood rigid, his expression unreadable, like he couldn't process what he was hearing. The officers remained calm, their faces grim. They had been expecting this. You had to stop her? The male officer repeated, his voice steady but probing. What happened, Jayla? What did you do? Jayla's body shook as she forced the words out, each one more painful than the last. She was going to hurt me. She said she'd never let me go. I didn't know what else to do. I just wanted her to stop. Her mother collapsed onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably, while her father stood there in stunned silence, his eyes wide with disbelief. Jayla's voice broke as she finished. I didn't mean to kill her. I just wanted it to be over. The female officer stepped forward, her tone gentle but firm. Jayla, we're going to need you to come with us. We'll take your statement at the station. Jayla nodded, tears streaming down her face. There was no fight left in her. She knew this was the end. There was no escaping what she had done. She had killed Amira, her stepsister, her friend, the girl she had loved. And now, she would have to face the consequences. As the officers placed handcuffs on her wrists, Jayla's dad finally spoke, his voice low and shattered. How could this happen? Jayla didn't have an answer. All she could do was cry as they led her out of the house, her mother's sobs echoing behind her. The weight of what she had done crashed over her in waves, threatening to drown her. As they drove away, the flashing lights of the police car illuminating the darkened streets of Maple Hill, Jayla realized one horrifying truth. She had thought that killing Amira would set her free, but in the end she had only trapped herself in a prison of her own making. The interrogation room was cold, sterile. Jayla sat in the small metal chair, her hands cuffed in front of her, her mind numb. The officers had left her alone for now, giving her time to sit with the crushing reality of what she had confessed. Amira was dead, and it was her fault. The door creaked open and the female officer from earlier stepped inside, followed by a detective Jayla hadn't seen before. He was older, his face lined with age and experience. He sat down across from Jayla, his gaze calm but piercing. "Jayla," the detective said softly, "I need you to walk me through exactly what happened that night at the cabin." Jayla swallowed hard, her throat dry. She didn't know if she could relive it. She didn't know if she could say the words out loud. But she had no choice. She took a deep breath, her voice shaky as she began. "It started with Tyler." The detective's eyes narrowed slightly, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. Jayla's voice broke as she recounted everything: the blackmail, the murder of Tyler, the fear that had consumed her, and finally, the fight with Amira that had led to her death. The words tumbled out, raw and painful, and by the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. "I didn't want to kill her," Jayla sobbed. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I just wanted her to stop." The detective leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He let out a long breath before speaking, his voice low and measured. "You're saying Amira was the one who killed Tyler Richardson?" Jayla nodded, her body trembling. "She told me she had to. She said he was going to ruin everything, that we had to protect ourselves. I didn't know what to do. I just went along with it." The detective studied her for a moment, then leaned forward. "And when Amira threatened you at the cabin, you thought you had no other choice but to defend yourself?" Jayla hesitated, her voice weak. She wasn't going to stop. She said she'd never let me go. The detective sat in silence for a long time, his eyes fixed on Jayla. Finally, he stood up and nodded to the female officer. "Take her statement. We'll need to verify everything, but it sounds like we have a lot to untangle here." Jayla watched him leave, her heart heavy with guilt and exhaustion. She had told them everything. There was no more hiding, no more lies. But instead of feeling relieved, Jayla felt empty. She had lost everything: her freedom, her family, her future. And worst of all, she had lost Amira. Hours later, after the statements had been taken and the evidence reviewed, Jayla sat in her cell, the cold metal bars a stark reminder of the prison she had created for herself. The world outside moved on, but for Jayla, time had stopped. There was no more running, no more pretending. All that was left was the crushing weight of her guilt. As she lay down on the hard cot, her mind filled with thoughts of Amira, the girl who had once been her everything, the girl she had loved and feared in equal measure, Jayla realized something she hadn't allowed herself to face before. Amira had been right. They had ruined each other, and there was no going back. The cell was cold, a sterile box that held Jayla's body but did little to contain her guilt. The clang of metal echoed in her ears as the door shut behind her, sealing her off from the world outside. She had never imagined her life would end up like this, trapped in a prison not just of steel bars but of her own making. Everything felt surreal. The day had passed in a blur of questions, tears, and confessions. Her parents' faces haunted her. Her mother's uncontrollable sobs, her father's stunned silence, the disbelief and horror that had settled into their eyes as they slowly realized what their daughter had done. She was no longer just Jayla Lewis, she was a killer. The walls seemed to close in on her as she sat on the hard cot, her legs drawn up to her chest, her body trembling. The confession, the murder, the lies, it had all come crashing down around her, and now there was nothing left. No escape, no redemption, and worst of all, no Amira. Jayla closed her eyes, trying to block out the image of Amira's lifeless body lying in the woods, blood seeping into the ground. It was a memory she would never escape, a moment that would replay in her mind over and over for the rest of her life. She had killed her, the girl she had loved more than anyone, the girl who had been her everything, even when things had turned dark. But was that really true? Had Amira ever really been the girl Jayla thought she was? Or had their bond been doomed from the start, poisoned by secrets and lies? The hours passed slowly, the night outside the cell stretching on, endless and suffocating. Jayla barely moved, her body too numb to register the cold or the discomfort. Her mind drifted through fragments of memories, moments of her life before everything went wrong. She remembered the day her mother married Malcolm, when Amira had first become her stepsister. There had been an instant connection, a bond that neither of them could explain but both had felt. It was like they were meant to be in each other's lives, destined to find one another even if their paths had started out in different places. They had been inseparable back then. The first few months as stepsisters had been a whirlwind of laughter and late-night conversations. They had shared everything, dreams, fears, and eventually, their love for each other. But somewhere along the way, that love had twisted into something dark, something neither of them could control. Amira had always been the stronger one, the one who took control of every situation. She had a magnetism about her, a way of pulling people in, making them trust her even when they shouldn't. Jayla had been caught in that orbit, and she hadn't realized until it was too late just how dangerous it was. She thought back to Tyler, the way his smirk had disappeared when Amira confronted him in the locker room, the way Amira had told Jayla afterward, her voice calm, that it had to be done, that they had no other choice. Amira had said the same thing about Tyler that she had later said about Jayla. He was a threat, and threats had to be eliminated. Jayla shuddered, tears stinging her eyes as the weight of it all crushed her. How had it come to this? How had love turned into murder? Her thoughts spiraled, and suddenly she wasn't alone in the cell anymore. In her mind, Amira was there, sitting across from her on the cold floor, her dark eyes locked on Jayla's, a knowing smile on her lips. "You did what you had to do," Amira said, her voice soft, almost gentle. Jayla's heart twisted painfully. She wanted to scream, to tell Amira that none of this should have happened, that they should have stopped before it went too far. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat in silence, her chest heaving as she fought back sobs. Amira's image shifted, flickering like a shadow in the dim light. "You always thought you were the weak one, didn't you? But look at you now, Jayla. You won." Jayla shook her head violently, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, I didn't win. I lost everything." Amira tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You lost me." The words hung in the air, a knife twisting in Jayla's chest. She had lost Amira, not just to death, but long before that, when the love they had once shared turned into something darker. The moment Tyler was killed, something inside Amira had shifted, and Jayla had felt it too. A distance between them that no amount of whispered promises could close. "I didn't want this," Jayla whispered, her voice broken. "I didn't want any of this." Amira's eyes softened, but the darkness never left them. "I know." For a moment the cell was silent, the air thick with the unspoken truths between them. Jayla stared at the ghost of Amira, her mind filled with memories of the girl she had once loved, the girl who had been her best friend, her lover, her partner in everything. And then Amira's voice cut through the silence once more, cold and unforgiving. "But you did it anyway." The trial came faster than Jayla had expected. The media storm surrounding Amira's death and Tyler's murder had turned Maple Hill into the center of a small-town tragedy, the story too sensational to ignore. Every headline, every news report was filled with words like betrayal, teen lovers, and murderous secrets. Jayla's life had been reduced to a scandal, her name forever tied to the violence that had unfolded between her and Amira. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and faces Jayla wished she didn't recognize. Friends from school, teachers, neighbors. They all stared at her, eyes wide with disbelief and judgment. Her parents sat in the front row, their faces gaunt, drained by grief and confusion. They still didn't fully understand. Jayla wasn't sure she did either. The prosecution painted her as a girl trapped in a toxic relationship, manipulated by a dangerous lover into committing terrible acts. They focused on Amira's dominance, on the fear Jayla must have felt as she was pulled deeper into Amira's web of lies and violence. They called it self-defense, though Jayla wasn't sure if that was true. The defense argued that Jayla had been scared, that she had acted out of desperation, that Amira had pushed her to the edge and she had snapped. But no one knew the whole truth. How deeply twisted their relationship had become, how both of them had contributed to the destruction of their lives. Jayla sat there silent as her life was picked apart in front of her. She could barely feel anything anymore. The numbness had settled in long ago after the confession, after the police had taken her away. She was hollow now, just a shell of the girl she had once been. When the verdict came, it was almost anticlimactic. Manslaughter. Jayla would spend the next decade of her life in prison, and even after she was released, she would never truly be free. She would carry Amira's death with her for the rest of her life, the weight of that moment in the woods pressing down on her like a stone she could never set down. The first night in prison was the hardest. The cell was different from the one she had been held in during the investigation. Darker, colder. The other inmates kept their distance, sensing the weight of what she had done, the darkness that clung to her like a shadow. Jayla lay on the thin mattress, staring up at the ceiling, the sounds of the prison echoing around her, metal doors clanging, distant voices, the shuffle of feet on concrete floors. She felt more alone than she had ever felt in her life. But she wasn't alone, not really. In her mind, Amira was still there, always with her. Her voice whispered in the dark, soft and cruel, reminding Jayla of everything she had lost, everything they had lost. You did what you had to do. Amira's voice echoed in the silence, just like it had in the cell that first night. You survived. Jayla closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered back into the darkness. I'm sorry. But the apology felt hollow, meaningless, because deep down, Jayla knew the truth. She hadn't just killed Amira, they had killed each other, and now there was no one left to save. The years passed slowly, the days blending together in an endless blur of monotony. Jayla adapted to life in prison, but the guilt never left her. Every night she dreamed of Amira, of her laughter, her smile, and the moment everything had gone wrong. She had thought killing Amira would set her free, but it had only chained her to the past, to the memory of the girl she had loved and lost. Amira would always be with her, a ghost that haunted every corner of her mind. In the end, Jayla realized that there was no escape. Not from her past, not from the choices she had made, and not from Amira, the girl she had once loved, the girl she had destroyed, the girl who had destroyed her. As the years stretched on, Jayla would sometimes sit in the prison yard, staring up at the sky, wondering what her life could have been if things had gone differently, if she and Amira had never met, if they had walked different paths. But it was too late for that now. The past was a weight she couldn't shake, a prison she would never leave. And somewhere, deep down, Jayla knew that even if she could go back, even if she could change everything, she wouldn't, because in some twisted, broken way she still loved Amira, and a part of her always would, even if it had ruined them both.